There is a school on the Moray Firth coast of northeast Scotland where the wind comes in off the grey water in February, so cold and so persistent that the boys who run cross-country at 6 in the morning return to their dormitory with frost in their hair and the smell of wet pine on their kit. The school sits 2 miles inland from the cliffs at Hopeman, near the small market town of Elgin, in a flat sweep of fields and forestry on the edge of the Laich of Moray. The main building is a 17th century mansion of pale local sandstone, 3 stories high, its windows narrow against the Highland winter. Around it stands the strangest building on any school campus in Britain, a perfectly circular stone structure, 90 feet across, originally raised in the 1690s as a private hippodrome for a Scottish baronet rumoured by his neighbours to have studied the dark arts in Padua. It is called the Round Square. The school is Gordonstoun. This is the dark story of Britain's most damned school. 600 pupils, £45,000 a year in fees, 3 British monarchs in waiting sent through its corridors in the space of 1 human lifetime. A founder who fled Hitler with a price on his head and built, in the corner of Scotland, furthest from the gas chambers he had escaped, a regime of cold water swimming and forced runs that he believed would inoculate the next generation against tyranny. And a 13-year-old boy, deposited at its gates on the 1st of May 1962, who would go on to become King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and who described the place in a letter to a friend, in a phrase his authorised biographer would publish 27 years later as Colditz in Kilts. Not a public school in the Eton mould, not a Highland boarding house in the sleepy Argyll tradition, not even a regular fee-paying establishment as the British class system understood the term in 1934. Gordonstoun is where a German Jewish reformer with a price on his head set up a survival camp for the sons of the British ruling class, where the consort of a queen learned to sail, where a king of England was bullied for being shy, where the boy who would one day wear the crown of St. Edward wrote home, again and again, in the careful, neat handwriting of a child, that he hated the place he was confined to. If you find these deep investigations into Britain's great houses and the hidden lives within them worth your time, please subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me which estate we should explore next and help these stories reach the audience they deserve. It begins with a German educator running for his life in 1933 in the small university town of Salem on the shores of Lake Constance in southern Germany. A 47-year-old headmaster called Kurt Hahn sat in his study and wrote a public letter denouncing Adolf Hitler. Hahn was the son of a Jewish industrialist from Berlin. He had been educated at Christ Church, Oxford. He had served as private secretary to Prince Max von Baden, the last imperial chancellor of Germany, during the negotiations that ended the First World War. And in 1920, with the prince's backing, he had founded a boarding school in the prince's converted castle at Salem, where the sons of the surviving German nobility were to be educated according to a philosophy Hahn had developed by reading Plato's Republic in the trenches. The philosophy was simple. The modern child, Hahn argued, was being raised soft. Cars were replacing legs. Memory was replacing thinking. Spectator sport was replacing exertion. Politeness was replacing courage. The result, he warned in lecture after lecture, would be a generation of young Europeans incapable of resisting the cheap promises of demagogues. The cure was a regime of physical hardship combined with practical service to the community. Cold water swimming before breakfast. Cross-country running in all weathers, manual labour on the land, compulsory rescue training, and a moral curriculum based on what Hahn called the 7 Laws of Salem. In January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor. 6 weeks later, in the town of Potempa in Upper Silesia, 5 brown shirts kicked a communist coal miner to death in front of his mother. When Hitler intervened to commute their death sentences, Hahn published an open letter to old boys of Salem, demanding that any Salem old boy who was also a brown shirt resign from the school immediately. 8 days later, he was arrested by the Gestapo, taken to a prison in Stuttgart. He was 47 years old, was Jewish. He had humiliated the new chancellor. Reasonable expectation. He was about to die. He did not die. Of accident, intervention by Ramsay MacDonald, then the British Prime Minister, who had once met Hahn at a peace conference in Berlin, and the intercession of the Bishop of Chichester. Hahn, after 5 months and expelled from Germany, arrived in Britain in the late summer of 1933 with a small suitcase, no money, and a single idea: to recreate Salem in exile, somewhere the Gestapo could not reach. A consortium of British educators and Scottish landowners, alerted to his arrival by William Temple, the future Archbishop of Canterbury, began searching for a site. They found it where a widowed Scottish noblewoman called Lady Joan Cumming Gordon had inherited a decaying 17th century estate could afford to keep up. The estate was called Gordonstoun. The house had been built between 1638 and 1645 by Sir Robert Gordon of Gordonstoun, a Scottish baronet and antiquary who had served as vice-chamberlain to Charles I. Later in the century, his grandson, also called Sir Robert, the third baronet, had added the circular building known as the Round Square, a perfect, originally intended as a covered exercise yard for his horses. The third baronet was he had studied at Padua, where his neighbours later whispered he had taken instruction in alchemy and necromancy. He had a laboratory at Gordonstoun, where he conducted experiments by candlelight. The villagers of called him the Wizard Laird, and a story, repeated in the parish records of 1704, held that on the night he died, the devil came in person to collect what was owed. The square, the locals said, had been built so the devil could ride his horse around it without ever finding a corner in which to escape. The Wizard Laird died in his own in March 1704, found by his manservant with his hand still resting on a leather-bound Paracelsus and a small phial of mercury overturned on the beside him. The parish register at Burney recorded the cause of death as apoplexy. The villagers preferred their other story. For the next 2 centuries, the Gordon family of Gordonstoun declined, sold off outums, married into the Cumming line of nearby Altia, and the great house passed slowly out of habitation. By 1900, the round square was being used as a hay barn. By 1925, the 17th century mansion had been closed up entirely, windows boarded, its chimneys cold, its long galleries given over to mice and the damp salt wind off the Firth. This was the building Hahn proposed to turn into the central hall of his new school. On 27th November 1934, with 18 pupils, a part-time matron, chapel, Gordonstoun School opened its doors. The fees were £50 a term. The compulsory uniform included shorts to be worn year-round, regardless of weather. The school day began at 7 in the morning with a half-mile run across the estate, followed by a cold water plunge in the unheated outdoor pool that Hahn's pupils had dug by hand the previous summer. Motto, embroidered onto every blazer, was Hahn's, taken from his old maxim and translated into the Latin of the Gordon family, plus est en vous. There is more in you than you think. In January 1995, the second term, a 13-year-old boy with a Greek accent, and a guardian in the Royal Navy, enrolled as pupil number 19. His name was Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. His mother was in a Swiss sanatorium. His father lived with a mistress in Monte Carlo. His 4 sisters had all married German nobles, several of them by then in the SS. His uncle and guardian, Lord Louis Mountbatten, had been advised by Hahn's German collaborator, Kurt Mayer, that the boy needed somewhere to belong. Salem was now closed to him. The Gestapo had taken over Hahn's old school and were re-educating its pupils as Hitler Youth officers. Gordonstoun was the answer. Philip thrived. He was made captain of cricket and captain of hockey. He led the seamanship class. He helped build the school's first sailing ketch, the Diligent. He took the 7 laws of Salem and made them his personal code. In a confidential report to Mountbatten in 1937, Hahn wrote of his star pupil, "He is a born leader, but he will need the exacting demands of a great service to do justice to himself. His best is outstanding. His second best is not good enough." 2 years later, in 1939, Philip left Gordonstoun for the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. He carried the laws of Salem with him for the rest of his life. He would say, decades later, in an interview broadcast on the BBC in 1969, that Gordonstoun had been the making of him. He would also say, in the same broadcast, that his son needed exactly the same treatment. The son was Charles Philip Arthur George, the boy who would be king. He had been born on 14th of November 1948 in the Bull Room at Buckingham Palace, the first child of the future Elizabeth II and the man who had captained Gordonstoun's hockey team a decade earlier. He was shy. He cried easily. He preferred reading to rugby. His grandmother, the Queen Mother, who had been raised in the soft Edwardian manner of the Strathmore family at Glamis Castle, told Lady Cynthia Spencer, her lady-in-waiting, in the autumn of 1962 that her grandson was being asked to endure a regime entirely foreign to his temperament. The line, recorded by Hugo Vickers in his 2005 authorised biography of the Queen Mother and dated by Vickers to a conversation at Burkle on the Balmoral estate, was 9 words long. "It is the wrong place for him. She lost the argument," Prince Philip insisted. On the morning of 1st May 1962, a 13-year-old boy in the grey shorts and grey shirt of the Gordonstoun uniform was driven from Lossiemouth railway station to the school gates in a green Land Rover. He was put down in front of Windmill Lodge, the converted farm building that served as the most exposed of the school's 6 boarding houses. He was shown to a wooden cubicle measuring 6 feet by 8, with a window that did not close properly. He was told that his housemaster was the Honourable Donald Wills. He was told that his cross-country course began behind the kitchen garden. He was told that no special treatment of any kind would be offered or accepted. In the small hours of his first night, the boys in the adjoining cubicles began creaking their bed springs in unison. It was a planned and rehearsed campaign. It would continue, with intermittent variations, for the next 5 years. The cubicle measured 6 feet long by 8 feet wide. It contained a single iron bedstead, a horsehair mattress, a wooden chair, a small chest of drawers with a mirror above it, and a hook for a dressing gown. The floor was bare boards. The walls of the cubicle were wooden partitions 7 feet high, leaving a gap of 2 feet between the top of the partition and the ceiling of the dormitory. Sound travelled freely across this gap. So did the smell of damp socks drying on radiators, the smell of carbolic disinfectant the matron applied weekly, and the smell of the North Sea, which on certain mornings in February came through the cracked window so cold and so present that the boys later said it felt like sleeping outside. Charles slept in this cubicle for the entirety of his first 3 years at the school. He moved to a slightly larger one in the senior wing for the final 2. The brass plaque marking it as his was added in 1969. 2 years after he left, on the instructions of the then bursar. What happened to Charles at Gordonstoun between May 1962 and the summer of 1967 is the most carefully documented of all his school experiences, because in 1992, the Prince granted Jonathan Dimbleby unprecedented access to his private papers for the purpose of writing an authorised biography. Dimbleby's book, The Prince of Wales, was published by Little Brown in 1994. It runs to 620 pages. Chapter 3, which covers the Gordonstoun years, runs to 43 pages. It is the closest thing the historical record possesses to the prince's own account of those 5 years. He read the chapter in proof. He signed it off. Every quotation in it from his own letters and diaries was authorised for publication by the future king himself, according to Dimbleby. On page 65 of the book, Charles wrote to a cousin in June 1963, after his first full year at the school, "I hated the place I was confined to." According to Dimbleby, on page 84 of the same book, Charles wrote to a friend in the autumn of 1964. At the start of his 3rd year, the school was Colditz in kilts. These are the 2 phrases that have followed Charles for the rest of his life. They were not leaked. They were not stolen by a tabloid. They were placed by the prince himself, through his chosen biographer, into the public record. They are, in the strict legal sense, his own published account of his school days, made when he was 44 years old and could no longer be dismissed as a boy exaggerating. The bullying that prompted them began in the dormitory and never properly ended. Dimbleby describes, on pages 66 to 72, a campaign of low-grade persecution that exploited every aspect of Charles's situation. The other boys would not sit next to him in class for fear of being called creep or sucker up. They would not pass him in the corridor without making a noise. They would lean against the partition of his cubicle in the night to keep him awake. They would announce loudly when he entered the changing room that the room had just been disinfected. On the cross-country course, which the head groundsman William Anderson had laid out across the dunes and pine woods of the estate, Charles was made to run in shorts in the Highland winter, sometimes through snow lying ankle deep. Dimbleby records, on pages 70 and 71, that the prince described the cross-country runs in a letter home as the worst part of his life at the school, worse even than the dormitory. The headmaster was Robert Chew, a quiet, scholarly Yorkshireman who had succeeded Hans's deputy Henry Carmichael Brereton in 1953, and who took the view, conveyed in a letter to Buckingham Palace in November 1962, and quoted by Sally Bedell-Smith in her 2017 biography, that the prince was being treated no worse than any other new boy. The school's chairman of governors, Ian Tennant, Lord Tennant of Mar, took the same line in a private letter to the Duke of Edinburgh in early 1963. Charles's father agreed. In one of the few direct comments he ever made about his son's schooling, in an off-camera remark to a producer at the BBC in 1969, widely repeated in subsequent accounts, the Duke said he needed to be toughened up. He came out of it well. Lord Mountbatten took a different view, according to Anthony Holden. In his 1998 biography of Charles, on page 79, Mountbatten told a friend in 1963, "I told Philip not to send him there. He did not listen." Mountbatten had wanted Charles to go to Cheam Preparatory and then to Eton, the school where Sir Robert Burley had recently retired as headmaster, the school where almost every previous Prince of Wales had been educated, the school 4 miles from Windsor Castle where the boy's grandmother and mother could have seen him on weekends. He was overruled. The Queen, who privately favoured Eton, deferred to her husband. The Queen Mother, who favoured Eton even more privately, deferred to her daughter. Charles went to Gordonstoun. There were small mercies. The school chaplain, the Reverend Philip Crossfield, took it upon himself to invite the prince to tea in his rooms on Sunday afternoons. The art master, Robert Waddell, encouraged him to take up cello and pottery. The drama master cast him as the Duke of Exeter in a school production of Henry V. in the Lent term of 1965, then as Macbeth himself in the Michaelmas term of 1966, a piece of casting Charles remembered, in a letter cited by Dimbleby on page 76, as the first time he had felt entirely free at the school. The Macbeth production was reviewed in the school magazine The Gordonstoun Record by a sixth former who wrote that the prince's performance had shown an unexpected interior life. The line was probably written by Eric Anderson, then a young English master, later headmaster of Eton, and a man Charles would invite to dinner at Clarence House every year until Anderson's death in 2020. Anderson, in a brief published Times in 2006, recalled what he called the prince's saving grace at Gordonstoun, a quiet stubbornness that refused to perform unhappiness for the boys persecuting him. He would not give them the satisfaction. He simply went on work, attending, playing his cello, and writing that nobody at the school knew about. Those letters, after two, when Charles released them for Dimbleby's use, became the documentary spine of the chapter that the next 21 biographers of the king have all drawn from. There is no other comparable archive of future monarch's school day misery in language record. The signature episode came in June 1965. Charles was 16. He had been at the school 3 years. As part of the school's seamanship program, he was a member of a sailing trip aboard the Pinta, the school's train, which had put in at Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis on the evening of 17th of June. Charles, in the bodyguard, Detective Inspector Donald Green, and 4 other boys, was permitted to go ashore for dinner at the Crown Hotel. A crowd of curious onlookers gathered. Embarrassed, Charles excused himself, went into the public bar, and, in the words he himself used in a letter quoted by Dimbleby on page 74, I asked for the first drink that came into my head, which happened to be cherry brandy, because I'd drunk it before in out shooting. He was photographed. The story ran the following morning in every national newspaper. Charles was 16, 2 years under the legal drinking age in Scotland in 1965. His decision signed. The school was forced to deny that any rule had been broken. The boys back at Windmill Lodge, when turned, made a special point of creaking their beds particularly loudly that first night. The sometimes called the cherry brandy affair, sometimes the burnt cork incident, after a separate but related episode in which a half-smoked cigarette was found in Charles's cubicle and reported public dressing down in front of the whole house. Both episodes are described by Dimbleby on pages 73 to 75. The afternoon shaped the rest of his school career. The palace press secretary, Commander Richard Colville, was into a flat denial that the prince had ordered any alcoholic drink. The denial was disproved within 24 hours by the testimony of a barmaid at the Crown Hotel who had served Charles herself. Colville, embarrassed and outflanked, was eased into retirement at the end of the year. Detective Donald Green, the bodyguard who had failed to prevent the order, assigned to a desk at Scotland Yard. Gordonstoun governors received a strongly worded private letter from the Lord Chamberlain's office. Robert Chew, the headmaster, replied that the school had given Charles no special treatment because the prince's own father had insisted on the principle, that this was the consequence of the principle, and that the school had no plans to modify it. The reply is preserved in the Lord Chamberlain's papers in the Royal Archives at Windsor. It was not made public. They made of it a small Highland legend. For years afterwards, new boys arriving at Gordonstoun would be told the story of the cherry brandy on their first night, with the prince still in his school uniform, sometimes with the bodyguard buying the drink for him, sometimes with the Queen herself summoned to the Crown Hotel to drive her son home. None of these versions were true. All of them survived, in the way that boys' stories survive, than the truth. By 1980, when the prince's first marriage was being planned, the cherry brandy incident was being cited by gossip columnists as a sign of his independent streak. He had been 16. He had been a crowd that had not asked permission to gather. He had not, in essence, been independent at all. Charles left Gordonstoun in the summer of 1967. He had been head boy in his final term, an appointment he was not certain whether to interpret as recognition or as a final tightening of the screw. He had 2 A-levels, a B in history, a C in French. He had a place at Trinity College, Cambridge, secured by his Director of Studies, Lord Butler, more on the strength of his lineage than his marks. He left the school estate on the afternoon of July 1967. In a chauffeur-driven car. He did not return as a pupil. He has not, in nearly 6 since, returned as a visitor. His sister, Princess Anne, arrived as the first pupil 6 years later in September 1973. His youngest brother, Prince Edward, followed in 1977. His nephew James, Earl of Wessex, arrived in 2020. Each of them, in their turn, has spoken publicly about Gordonstoun in measured and great terms. Charles has not. What Hahn made and what Hahn lost, and stranger story, told only in the school archive at Elgin and in Herman Raws's 19 academic study of his work. The school had less than 6 years when the war Hahn had foreseen arrived. In the autumn of 1939, with German U-boats patrolling the Moray Firth, Air Ministry requisitioning the buildings of the Lossiemouth airfield 3 miles from the school, the Admiralty informed the governors that Gordonstoun's coastal site was incompatible with security. The school's German Jewish founder, the school's mostly British pupils, and the school's uneasy mixture of European refugees were to evacuate the premises by Easter 1940. To Wales, a consortium of the school's Welsh support, led by the family of David Davies, the first Lord Davies of Llandinam, made available the Davies family seat at Plas Dynam in Montgomeryshire. For 5 years, between 1940 and 1945, Gordonstoun operated out of borrowed rooms in a Welsh country house and out of a converted hotel down the road. The school's outdoor regime designed for the bracing fronts of the Moray Firth, was transplanted to the wet hills above the Severn. The cold water plunges took place in mountain streams. The cross ran along the old Drovers Road above Llanidloes. Hahn, enemy alien, though long since naturalised as a British subject, was forbidden to live within 10 miles of the coast and had to apply for special police permission to attend his own school's speech day. Hahn did in those Welsh years became the most influential part of his work. Cut off from the larger Gordonstoun he had hoped to build, received a smaller, more transferable version of his curriculum that could be delivered to any boy in any a single concentrated month. He called it the County Badge. By 1941, working with the shipping magnate Lawrence Holt, had developed it into a 4-week residential training course aimed at the young merchant sea. Torpedoed ships were filling the convoy's lifeboats with hypothermic teenagers. The course was based at the Outward Bound Sea School on the Welsh coast. It became in time the Outward Bound Trust, which now operates 5 countries and through which more than 1 million young people have passed. Its founding principles are Hahn's Sevens of Salem, lightly translated. The other transferable child was longer in coming. In 19, sitting in Buckingham Palace with his old pupil and now son-in-law of the monarch Prince Philip, Hahn proposed a national award scheme for young people aged 14 to 25, structured around 4 sections taken directly from the Salem curriculum: service, physical activity, skills, and an expedition. Philip undertook to lend his name and his time. The Duke of Edinburgh's award was launched on 21st February 1956, with an initial enrolment of 7,000 and a target of attracting 50,000 within 5 years. More than 8 million participants worldwide. Every golder in every country it operates in has earned a badge designed by Philip and graded against criteria written by Hahn between 1941 and 1956 in rooms in Llandinam, Aberdofi and Elgin. The Welsh interval also shaped the school's institutional memory in a way few of its post-war prospectuses ever quite acknowledged. The pupils who arrived at Plas Dinam in the spring of 1940 were a strange mixture of British naval officers, a handful of European refugee boys whose parents had paid in advance and then been lost in the chaos of the occupations, of Czech and emigres placed in the school by the British government's Care of Children scheme. They lived 4 to a room in a country house that had been built for a liberal coal magnate and then designed to accommodate 100 boys at trestle tables in the converted ballroom. They studied in the gun room, the library, the conservatory, and on the lawn under the cedars. They were taught by a faculty that had shrunk by 1943 to 9 men and 3 women, all of them volunteers from the local Welsh parishes. The school's wartime fees were reduced by a third. Hahn met the shortfall by appealing personally to old boys and to American sympathizers, including a small group of Quakers from Pennsylvania who sent annual checks throughout the war. The Quaker connection would, after 1945, become one of the founding networks of the American Outward Bound movement. Hahn to Gordonstoun in 1945, a hero of British education and a man permanently shaken by what had happened to his sister and his cousins in the camp. He retired in 1953, the year Robert Chew became head, and lived quietly in Hermannsburg in Bavaria until his death in 1974. He never saw the cherry brandy incident in the papers. He never read Dimbleby's book. He had been told, before he died, that the heir to the British throne had described his school in kilts. He is said to have wept. The unfinished thread of the school's 20th century is darker. Between 2000 and 2020, in the wake of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, the Abuse Inquiry under Lady Smith took evidence from a number of former Gordonstoun pupils relating to the period between the late 1950s and the early 1990s. The hearings were public. The file had been published. Several of the school's former staff, in posts since closed, were named in evidence as having committed serious offences against pupils in their care. The findings have been published. Several of the school's former staff, in posts since closed, were named in evidence as having committed serious offences against pupils in their care. The school issued an unreserved apology in March 2021. It acknowledged what the inquiry had found. It announced new safeguarding protocols, the historical record of those decades, of the building and the regime that Hahn had built, and the way his successors had, in places, let his principles curdle into something else, is now a matter of public legal record. It is no longer a school's private matter, but the school that astonishes the parents who drive up to Lossiemouth station on the first day of every Michaelmas term was not built by the German Jewish reformer whose statue stands in the courtyard, nor by the wizard laird whose round square crowns the campus, nor by the British monarchs whose names are pinned to the cubicles in Windmill Lodge. It was built and kept running by 3 orders of staff whose names exist only in the school's bound wage ledgers, copies of which are held in the Moray Council Archive in Elgin and the National Records of Scotland in Edinburgh. Their presence at Gordonstoun is documented, recorded in ink on paper. Their stories are not. There was a head matron at Windmill Lodge called Margaret Forbes, who served at Gordonstoun for 17 years between 1958 and 1975. She had trained as a nurse at the Aberdeen Royal Infirmary in the early 1930s. She had served in the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service during the war. She had come to Gordonstoun in her own application letter, preserved in the school's pension files, for a quieter life among boys after the soldiers. She received £400 a year and her board. She was the woman who put Prince Charles to bed on his first night in the dormitory in May 1962, and the woman who, by Dimbleby's account, told him on his last night in July 1967 that he had been the politest boy she had ever looked after. She retired in 1975 on a pension of £80 a year. The records show she moved to Forres. We know she lived alone. We know nothing else. There was a head groundsman called William Anderson who served at Gordonstoun for 30 years between 1960 and 1990. He had grown up on a tenant farm above Aberlour. He had served 3 years in the Black Watch in Korea. He had laid out, between 1962 and 1964, the 4-mile cross-country course that ran from the eastern edge of the kitchen garden through the pine woods and along the dunes to the cliffs at Hopeman and back. He was paid £11 a week in 1962, with an extra pound for the Highland winter months between November and March. He was the man Prince Charles passed every morning of his 5 years at the school. There exists, in the school photograph album of 1965, a single image of Anderson with a clipboard and a stopwatch beside the start line on the morning of the school's Interhouse Cross-Country Championship. He retired in 1990 and died in Burghead in 1998. We know he had a wife. We know he had 3 sons. We know nothing else. There was a laundress called Anna Stewart who served at Gordonstoun for 23 years between 1962 and 1985. She had come from a fishing family in Buckie. She had been widowed in 1959 when her husband's drifter went down off the Pentland Firth in a January gale. She had 4 children and a war widow's pension that did not cover the rent. The school employed her from January 1962 at £3 and 10 shillings a week to wash and press the games kit of 120 boys in Windmill, Bruce, Cumming, Round Square, Plewlands and Altyre houses. For 5 Highland winters, she washed the sweat-stained, frost-stiffened cross-country shorts of the boy who would be king. She is recorded in the wage book as Mrs. A. Stewart, then later just as A. Stewart, then in her final years simply as Anna. She retired in 1985 with a small lump sum and a card signed by the headmaster. She is buried in the parish churchyard at Rathven. We know she was there. We know nothing else. They appear in the records as footnotes, a name beside a sum, a quarterly wage entered into a bound ledger. And then they vanish into the silence that swallows everyone in a great school who is not a member of the founding faculty or the royal alumni. The school absorbed each of them as it absorbed everything else, their working lives, their off-duty hours, their small accumulated kindnesses to the boys in their care, and in the end, the fact of their being there at all. We know only that they were there, that the school they served is still standing, and that their names survived. Some of them, because the Gordonstoun Bursar's office kept its accounts in good order through every war and every reform, and nobody in the 90 years since 1934 ever threw the wage books away. Gordonstoun today, a school of 600 pupils, 2/3 boys and 1/3 girls, drawn from 46 countries. The fees are £45,500 a year for boarders in 3 terms. The school went fully co-educational in 1922 after Prince's arrival and has admitted girls to every house since. The most extreme elements of the Han regime, including the cold water plunge before breakfast and the wearing of shorts in all weathers, were modified between the mid-1980s and the early 2000s and have been replaced, in most cases, by optional fitness and the standard British boarding uniform of grey trousers and a navy blazer. The cross-country course William Anderson laid out in 1962 is still in use. The Wednesday afternoon community service requirement, central to Han's original curriculum, is still mandatory for every pupil. The Round Square has, in the years since the Second World War, given its name to a network of 40 boarding schools across continents that subscribe to Han's educational principles. Pupils from Round Square schools spend exchange terms at each other's campuses. The network's annual conference rotates between member schools. Gordonstoun, the founding school, is its spiritual home. The famous alumni list has continued to grow. Princess Anne, who arrived in 1973 and left in 1978, has served as a school patron and visits each year. Prince Edward, who attended between 1970 and 1982, has spoken warmly of his experience on multiple occasions. James, Earl of Wessex, the King's nephew and Edward's son, attended between 2020 and 2020 and was head boy in his final term. Zara Tyndall, the King's niece, attended between 1995 and 2000. David Lewis, who managed Oasis at the height of, was a Gordonstoun boy in the 1970s. His son Jason was at the school in the early 1980s. Duncan Bannatyne, the entrepreneur, sent his children there in the 2000s. The King himself has visited the region of his school days exactly since his coronation in May 2023, when he travelled to Birkhall, the Queen Mother's old house on the Balmoral estate that he inherited in 2002. Birkhall is 63 miles from Gordonstoun by road, and the King's helicopter route from Abbotsford within 12 miles of the school's main gate. He has not landed, has not been driven the 12 miles. He has issued, through his private secretary, the standard royal good wishes to the school on its 90th anniversary in November 2024. He has not attended in person. There have been changes to the regime that Han himself, had he lived to see them, might have found unrecognisable. The compulsory morning run is now optional. The cold water pool, dug by the 18 original pupils in 1934, was filled in during the renovations 7 and replaced by a heated indoor facility. The shorts in all weathers rule was abandoned by 1990. The 7 laws of Salem, originally posted in every dormitory in Han's own translation, were quietly removed from the walls in the 1980s and now exist in display in the school library with a small explanatory plaque beside them noting that they represent the founders' original vision and should be read in the context of their time. The Wednesday Community Summit remains. So does the seamanship program on the Sea Spirit of Moray, the school's current training vessel, successor to Philip's old Diligent and Charles's old Pinter. So does the cross-country course, mostly, though a section near the dunes has been rerouted in recent years to avoid an area of protected machair grassland. The school contributes, estimate of the Moray Council in its 2023 Economic Impact Survey, approximately £100 million a year to the local economy, wages, services and visitor traffic. It is the second largest Elgin travel to work area after the Royal Air Force Station at Lossiemouth. Its accounts are fully with the Scottish charity regulator. Its safeguarding policies are reviewed twice a year by an independent panel chaired by a retired Court of Session judge. In the courtyard at the centre of the campus, beside the 17th century mansion the wizard Laird built, and the round square he raised to confound the devil, there stands a small bronze plaque set into a low wall of pale Moray sandstone. The plaque, unveiled in 1904 on the school's 50th bears Hahn's name and the dates of his life. Below his name is the school motto in the original Latin of the Gordon family, the life from Salem to the trenches to the prisons of Württemberg and the Highland coast, and which every boy who has gone through the school for 90 years, including the boy who would be king, has had embroidered on his blazer pocket. Plus est en vous, more in you than you think. Stand at the gates of Gordonstoun on a February afternoon when the wind off the earth is at its sharpest, and the rooks above the round are noisy in the bare beech trees, and the cross-country squad is coming back along the dunes in the last grey light, and the lovely Highland is more complicated than it looks. The 17th century mansion the wizard laird built is older and stranger than its quiet sandstone face suggests. The round square is not, despite the legends, a perfectly closed ring. It has, since 1947, contained a small modern doorway cut into its east wall to permit fire safety egress. The pale the masons quarried at Hopeman in 1638 has died in patches where 90 years of Highland weather and 90 years of boys' shoulders have rubbed against it. The cracks the wizard's grandfather paid to have repointed in 1701 have, in places, opened again. Gordonstoun is not one school. It is the record, stone and granite and salt bleach pine, of 9 decades of the British class system's attempt to manufacture, on the coldest coast in the kingdom, the kind of leader it could no longer produce by inheritance alone. Kurt Hahn wanted a fortress against tyranny, the school that became outward bound, and the Duke of Edinburgh's award. Prince Philip wanted a place that would belong to him. The school gave him a cricket cap and a sailing certificate, maxim he carried for 70 years. Prince Charles wanted to go to Eton. The school gave him 5 winters in a wooden cubicle, that would be quoted against him for the rest of his life. The Queen Mother wanted her grandson sent somewhere kind. The school absorbed her objection and made no record of it. The Honourable Hills wanted a head of house who would set a good example. The school housemaster to the heir to the throne, and gave him, in the end, a never come back. Margaret Forbes wanted a quieter life among boys. After the soldiers, the school gained years of putting other women's children to bed. William Anderson wanted a trade and a steady wage. The school gave him a course laid out with his own hands across the dunes of Moray. Stuart wanted the rent paid. The school gave her 23 years of washing the kit of boys whose names she could not always be told. Gave them all what they asked of it in the careful, expensive, neutral manner of a great Highland institution accustomed to absorbing human weather. The school always gives. That is its genius, and that is its cost. The bursar's office still files its accounts on the same shelves where Margaret Forbes's pension was logged in 1975, and William Anderson's winter bonus was logged in every November from 1962 to 1989. And Anna's weekly £3 and 10 shillings was logged from 1962 to 5 in the round patient hand of a clerk whose name is Ox, and whom nobody now alive remembers. They are the school's curated memory, the part of its history it keeps in writing because it has always kept everything in writing. They are still in the ledgers, in the small, careful entries with sums beside them. They always will be. Who does a school belong to? The German Jewish reformer who founded it as an act of defiance against the regime that had imprisoned him, the wizard laird whose hippodrome forms its central building and whose ghost the local school children still draw at Halloween, the 18 pupils of 34, naval cadet from Greece who became the consort of a queen, the Buckingham Palace who became the king, the matron who put him to bed, the ground timed his runs, the laundress who washed his kit, the Ladysmith inquiry that 80 years on finally heard the voices of the boys whose suffering had been written out of every. Gordonstoun does not answer. The school never answers. It simply stands in the flat Highland sweep to inland from Hopeman, with its windows narrowly wind and its bronze plaque catching the last of the afternoon light, and lets you decide. There is, in Windmill Lodge, on the door of one wooden cubicle in the boys' dormitory passage, a discreet brass plaque, no larger than a man's hand, engraved with the dates in 62 to 1967, and a single set of initials. The cubicle is in use this term, as in every term since 1967, by a 13-year-old boy who arrived on the 1st of September with a trunk and a name tag and a regulation grey blazer. He will sleep in the cubicle for 1 academic year, move up to a senior house, and another boy will move in. The brass plaque will remain. The dates will not change. The initials are HRAG for His Royal Highness Charles Philip Arthur George, the boy who would be king. He sleeps by the school's quiet convention, who has slept in that cubicle since. Every Sunday, letter home written space. Every cross-country morning, when the wind off the firth comes in cold, and the boys come back with frost in their hair. He is still up there. He always will be. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see a building differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which estate, dynasty, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.